Hi, I'm Christina. Today I want to show you how you can turn some fresh oranges into a lovely orange marmalade, which of course is delicious. Okay, so for this recipe, you're going to use 1 3/4 pounds of oranges. If you have good sized oranges from the store, it's probably about 4 or 5 oranges. I use the oranges from my tree. They're rather smaller, so I'm using 7 oranges. I've used a food scale to measure it out to make sure I had a 1 3/4 pounds. You're going to use 1 fresh lemon, and you're going to use 6 cups of water. I just showed 2 here so I remember. And eventually you're going to throw in 3 pounds and 12 ounces of sugar. It's a lot of sugar, but it tastes great at the end. If you don't have a food scale and don't want to measure it out using your cups, the other easy way to do it is grab a 4-pound sack of sugar and just measure out a half a cup. Because again, each cup is 8 ounces and we're taking 4 ounces away from our 4 pounds. That leaves us with 3 pounds, 12 ounces. So to slice your oranges for the marmalade, if you have a mandolin, I'd recommend using that. If you don't, you can use a food processor or you can just cut by hand. I'm going to get rid of the little end bit because I don't want to have that little bit of clump in there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and use my mandolin to get consistent, even slices. Again, if you don't have a tool for something like this, go ahead and do it by hand. Once you've got some slices cut out, take your slices, and they recommend cutting them into, the recipe I had recommended cutting them into quarters. I just say give them a nice little dice is how I like to do it because I like to have smallish bits of my rind. If you see any seeds, pick those out as you go. When your orange is really small and you're worried about slicing off your fingers, don't. Just go ahead and do the rest by hand. So you can go ahead and cut it small and then spin it around and give it another little cut. These are all going to cook down so you won't notice the bigger bits, but the finer you can do it, the more the flavors will meld together evenly. The next thing we want for flavor is the zest of a lemon. I'm just going to go ahead and use this little microplane. We're just getting the very outer layer of the skin of the lemons. We're getting all the good flavors without too much of the bitterness of the pith. Which again, you wouldn't think it matters since we're throwing in almost 4 pounds of sugar and the pith of all those oranges, but apparently it does. We're just getting the zest. We're getting the good, intense flavor of the lemon without any of that bitterness. And then we're also going to get the juice of the lemon. This one does have seeds, so I'm going to juice it into a separate bowl, and that way I can get all the good juice that I want, pick out the seeds. You can also strain it out if you'd like before pouring that lemon juice into my orange mixture. The next step is to add 6 cups of water to our mixture of lemon juice, lemon zest, and our oranges. We need to get more water, but we're going to add 6 cups of water, and then we're going to bring it to a boil. Once it comes to a boil, we're going to stir frequently and let it boil for about 40 minutes until that fruit gets nice and soft. Okay, so the last step for this first part is to add in, again, the 6 cups of water. I already had 4 in there. Stir it up, let it come to a boil. You're going to still stir it here and there. And we want it to cook for about 40 minutes once it comes to a boil, and that's going to soften the fruit. While it's getting to that point right now, I can walk away for a moment. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple plates in the freezer. They recommend doing this so that later on, as it thickens, you'll be able to see that it's getting thick. But the way to test to make sure that your jam has thickened enough is once your plate, once you think that's thick and your plate is cold, you put a few drops on there, and then you let it sit for a moment, and then you tilt your plate and see if it runs. And if it doesn't run too much, if it's kind of like gelled, that's the way that you can tell for sure that it has thickened up enough. While your fruit is boiling, this is the perfect time to sanitize your jars. If you don't have a canning rack, place a clean towel on the bottom of your pot. Place your jars so that they are not touching each other. Add enough water to cover the jars by at least 1 inch, and then let them boil for at least 10 minutes. Then turn off the heat and add the lids. You do not want to boil your lids, but sitting in the hot water will help them to seal to your jars later on. So one tool that you might want to invest in if you plan on doing a lot of canning is a canning funnel. It has a nice wide mouth so you can set it into your jar easily and pour in. You don't strictly need it, but it is kind of helpful. It's a good idea to sanitize it before you use it, so I'm just going to go ahead and add it into my pot of boiling water. Once your mixture comes to a boil, go ahead and reduce the heat and then let it simmer for about 40 minutes. We're going to keep stirring. After about 40 minutes of simmering like that, increase your heat back to high heat. I brought it down to a medium for simmer. Add in your sugar, stir it in, and then we're going to let it cook for like about another 15 or 20 minutes. We're going to see it get darker. We can test for doneness. We'll see a couple signs. It'll look thicker. We'll see it turn darker. If you have a thermometer, we'll measure about 222 or 223 degrees. And finally, the other way we can test it will be to use that plate that we put in the freezer a while back to see if it sets on the cold plate. So I've had this boiling now for about 20 minutes since I added the sugar. I'm gonna go ahead and do all 3 of the little tests, and that way you can see, depending on what tools you have at home, so you'll get an idea of when you can tell it's ready. So first off, just looking at it, it's at a really nice rolling boil. It's a darker color than it was. It used to be a little more lemony yellow, and now it's a kind of orangey brown. The next test we're gonna do is we're gonna use our thermometer. If you have a candy thermometer, go ahead and use that. I like to use this little digital thermometer because it's easier for me to see. Sorry, let's get around. It should be measuring around 122, 123, and, or sorry, 222 and 223. Right now I'm at 222.1, so that's about perfect. But let's say you don't have a thermometer at home and you're not sure if your thing is ready. So what you want to do is take, again, we're still stirring as we go, take your frozen plate out of the freezer, throw about a teaspoon or so on there, let it sit for about 30 seconds. So we're just gonna hang out for a little bit, do a little bit of stirring. And what we're gonna do is once it's had a chance to sit for a while on that cold plate, we'll go ahead and tip it over. If it totally runs like water, then it's not thick enough. If it still runs a little bit, but it kind of sludges over, then that means it has gelled enough. And of course I didn't keep track of what 30 seconds was. So let's just give this a few more little stirs, and then we'll tip the plate and see what happens. Oh, we're getting close, I think. Feels about 30-ish seconds. Let's give it a go. Oh. So a little bit of movement, but again, slowly sliding down the plate. So that means it's gelled enough. We now have jam, yay! So let's go ahead and turn off our burner. And the next step will be to put this into cans. So if you haven't canned before, I was just gonna tell you how to do this process. Once you've boiled your jars and then let them sit in the hot water, you're going to use tongs to lift them out. I put mine onto a cutting board covered with a towel, and that way they can sort of dry out. Because again, these are sterile, they're clean. We want to try to minimize their exposure to stuff right now. That's also why I'm setting them down, so that way they can, if there's any water left in there, they'll drain out onto the clean towel. So when you're ready to add your jam into your jar, it's going to get hot. That's why I'm going to go ahead and use a pot holder to hold it first. If you have the funnel, use that so that way you won't get too much jam against the edge of your jar. If not, just use your ladle and be careful. But if you have the funnel, you don't have to be quite so careful. You can just go ahead and scoop it in. I want to get it to fill up just a little below the threads. I don't want to completely fill it because you want to leave a little bit of room in the jar on top. And there we go. There's my first jar filled. So a nice tool that you can get also is this magnetic lid lifter. It lets you put your, it lets you grab the lids right out of that hot water without burning your hands or touching too much of the lid, because again, we want to keep it clean. Before we put it onto our jar, we're going to give it one more wipe. We really want to make sure the jar, the glass jar, has a clean surface there. So when we put our lid onto it, that it is going to be a nice good seal. Before we boil it though, can't trust that it's going to stay in place on its own, so we're going to add the ring on. The ring just goes on. We're going to finger tighten it. So it's not tighten it as hard as you can with all of your muscles, just lightly holding onto it. Use your fingertips, give it a tight, and that's all you need. Another tool that you might want to get is this jar lifter. It's not as essential right now when you're putting it into the jar, into the pot of water, but when you're pulling it out after it's boiled, really helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and use these now to go ahead and start putting my jars back into my pot with the towel on the bottom. So my jars are back in the pot where I had boiled them earlier. I've still got at least an inch of water over the top. That's really important because again, we want them to be completely covered by the water. What I'm gonna do is put the lids back on them, bring them back up to a boil, let them boil for 10 minutes, and then we'll remove them from the hot water. So after they've boiled for 10 minutes, you can bring your jars out. And again, this is when it's great to have the can lifter. And pretty soon, as they start to cool, you'll hear them pop. So I like to have my marmalade on toast. Once you preserve it, it'll get even a little bit thicker than this. But really, I gotta say, one of my favorite times to eat it is when it's fresh made and you get to have it all hot like this, or it's still kind of warm. It's delicious. Once you do preserve it though, it'll last for about, I think usually about 18 months-ish or so. It shouldn't last that long, honestly, because it's delicious. If you don't want to eat all this yourself on toast, you can have it in lots of other recipes, or even better, give it as a gift to some friends. The last test, of course, is to give it a taste. That is sweet and delicious.